Pericles and Athens by A.R. Byrne. The Golden Age of Greece seen through the life of her leading statesmen. What was the title of this? A General of the Republic is chapter 4. Apart from the preparation of business for the assembly, the council was charged with a massive work, steadily increasing as life and finance became more complex, in the supervision of the officials and the 5 weekly audit of their accounts, a readiness of the grand session of the assembly, once in each pratanu, at which, if it all went well, the people formally approved of the actions of the council. At the same session, in latter days, and probably in Pericles' time too, the question of the food situation and the defense of the country were formally raised, so that the people might periodically review these vital matters without waiting for a crisis to develop. The council had to examine the successful candidates for the archonships and other offices now filled by lot, satisfying itself that there was nothing against them, and to require an account of their stewardship from outgoing magistrates and boards, including the council of the previous year. At the time with which we are now dealing, it could try and punish delinquent magistrates and sundry other offenders against the state, even with death in some cases. This was probably one of the powers transferred from the Areopagus to the Council of 500 by Ephialtes' reform. But within the next 12 years, the people, ever jealous of entrusting 2 great powers to one body, reduced the council's judicial power to that of committing for trial before an ordinary jury those against whom it was founded that there was a prima facie case. Prima facie case. Altogether, it is not surprising that to find the council met daily, except on holy days. So what were their holy days? The juries to whom the fall of the Areopagus had brought a great access of importance were drawn from a panel of several thousand citizens over the age of 30, attracted first, it appears, under an act proposed by Pericles, by a modest payment of 2 abals, a third of a drachma, per session from the state. Solon, over 100 years ago, had been the father of these courts too, when he gave the people the right of requiring an account of their acts from outgoing magistrates. He probably also regularized the right of appeal to the people of a magistrate's judicial sentence. The sovereign people assembled for the judicial purposes was called by Heliaea, or Haliaea, an archaic word which was in some other states meant the political assembly, different from ecclesia, As business increased, the Heliaea was divided into juries, empaneled and re-empaneled daily by lot in order to prevent bribery by ensuring that no citizen could know the composition of the court that was to try his case. Juries consisted of 501 members in most cases, 1,001, or even 1,501 in some big political trials. The jurors were mostly elderly men, for 2 abals a day, and not every day, made little appeal to the young and vigorous. President of each court was usually an archon, but he was purely a chairman, and responsible for preparing the case for trial and keeping reasonable order. There was no advice to the jury on points of law, and the juries though they were seldom corrupt, and, being Greeks, were far from unintelligent, were notoriously apt to be swayed by prejudice, reflecting only too faithfully, as Pericles himself once found, the state of public opinion at the passing hour. That's the problem with whether you have trial by a judge or a jury. There's always prejudices and stuff like that going on. Sure, we can temper these by saying, okay, here are these rules, here's exact cases of what the punishments are, conditions for throwing out the case, and no one being able to say anything otherwise. Well, say anything otherwise, but do otherwise would be a good system. But the defense of the evil, the striking out against the just, the modern way. The juries were the Haliaea, and the Haliaea was the sovereign people. Consequently, an appeal lay to a jury in all cases of importance, and from sentence of a jury as of the sovereign power there was no appeal, only if one could obtain a conviction for perjury, if one could prove, that is, that the sovereign people had been misinformed, might a case be reopened. The point of transferring the final verdict on officials from the council to a jury was simply that the people disliked letting any final decision remain outside of its own control and in that of an organized body, even of a year's duration, which might develop a separate esprit de corps. The juries reformed for every case were open to no such objection. One exception to the competence of the juries always remained: charges of willful murder, poisoning, and arson were always tried before the body of ex-archons, the Areopagus. Conservatism, much tinged with primitive superstition, played a great part in this. The court of the Areopagus was of immemorial antiquity, and said to have been established by the goddess Athens herself. What does Athens mean, by the way? The feeling that blood guilt was a pollution always remained strong, and the procedure in homicide cases archaic. Also, homicide was never treated at Athens as an offense against the state. It was an offense against the individual, and the prosecutor had to be the next of kin, not any citizen who chose, as in many other cases. Among executive officers, the 9 archons had inevitably, since they ceased to be elected, lost much of their prestige. In the Eponymus archon, or regent, still gave his name to the year, from midsummer to midsummer, and swore on entering office that all men should hold to the end of his tenure the property they held at its opening, as in the days of Acastos, the prehistoric king, in whose time the regency was set up, but his chief functions now were to administer legal business concerning property and the family, and to preside as titular head of the state at the more religious festivals, including the great dramatic festivals of the wine god, Bacchus, right? Is it Bacchus? Dionysus, yeah. The king presided over the more ancient festivals, as he had done since time immemorial, and also over trials involving religious pollution. Homicide trials before Areopagus, formerly the king's privy council, and trials for offenses against religion before a jury, and latter in the case of Socrates, the warlord presiding over war lawsuits, where either party was a foreigner, and offered the ancient sacrifices to the war god and to Artemis of the wild, the goddess of the wild frontier country. The 6 junior archons presided over the remaining jury courts. There was also an ever-increasing number of financial, economic, and police officials, port controllers, market controllers, inspectors of ways and measures, paymasters, receivers of taxes, and so on. Among them, the board of 10 treasurers of the goddess ranked high, and they were the keepers, jointly with the council of the Bullion Reserve, and were chosen from among the richest class of citizens only, both so that they may be less open to temptation, and so that if any regrettable delinquency occurred, the treasurers might have some property on which the republic might distrain. But even more important than these, throughout Pericles' career were the 10 Tamiae, treasurers of the Greeks, who received the contributions of the League cities to the treasury at Delos. Amid the tendency to substitute the drawing of lots for direct election, an exception was always made where expert knowledge was required, notably for some of the chief finance officials and the 10 generals, and in a state which was almost continuously at war, the generals, directly elected, often even re-elected, and trusted in so far as Demos on principle trusted anyone, rapidly became the leading ministers of the state. Theirs was the office to which not only a Kimon, but an Ephialtes inevitably inspired, and no voice is more likely to gain a hearing in the assembly than theirs. But only on military matters, but on high policy generally. But a position differed fundamentally from that of the modern cabinet ministers, to whom one instinctively compares them.